Back to the Future. Could it actually happen with a real time machine?
What if time travel was possible, but not in the way movies have taught us to imagine? What if a machine could do something far stranger than sending a person into the past or future? For decades, the story of Mike Markham has fascinated researchers, conspiracy theorists, and late-night radio listeners. Many believed he built a time machine and vanished. Others thought he died in a mysterious fire. But according to a shocking account that surfaced years later, Mike did not travel through time at all. Instead, he may have become disconnected from reality itself, creating one of the strangest mysteries ever told. The discovery that changed everything. Mike Markham was not a scientist employed by a prestigious university, a government laboratory, or a major technology company. He had no advanced degrees in physics and no team of researchers helping him test complex theories. Instead, he was an electronics enthusiast from rural Missouri whose fascination with machines bordered on obsession. For years, he spent countless hours taking apart devices and rebuilding them, driven by a simple desire to understand how things worked. From an early age, electricity captivated him. While other children played sports or spent time outdoors, Mike could often be found surrounded by wires, circuit boards, and broken appliances. Radios, televisions, motors, and discarded electronic equipment became his teachers. He scavenged parts from junkyards, studied electronics manuals, and taught himself through experimentation. To most people, the piles of scrap metal and broken equipment scattered around his workspace looked like junk. To Mike, they represented endless possibilities waiting to be discovered. By the early 1990s, his curiosity had evolved into increasingly ambitious experiments. Working alone inside his garage, he began investigating the behavior of high-voltage electrical fields. One of his primary projects involved a device known as a Jacob's ladder. The setup was relatively simple. Two metal rods were positioned in a V-shape, and a powerful electrical current created an arc that climbed upward between them. The crackling display was commonly used in science demonstrations and classrooms. But Mike was not satisfied with simply recreating a familiar experiment. One day, he decided to add an unusual element to the setup. He aimed a laser beam directly through the electrical arc. At first, nothing seemed different. The machine continued operating as it always had. Then he noticed subtle changes. The sound of the electrical discharge shifted into a different tone. The arc itself appeared more stable and focused, almost as if the field had become organized in a way he had never seen before. As he watched, something happened that would change the course of his life. A small metal washer sitting near the apparatus appeared to flicker. For the briefest moment, it vanished. Then it reappeared. Mike was stunned. He assumed he had imagined it. Fatigue, eye strain, or the bright electrical discharge might have created an illusion. Yet the experience stayed with him. Determined to find an explanation, he repeated the experiment again and again. The same thing happened. He placed screws, coins, bolts, and other small metal objects near the field. Occasionally, when the conditions seemed just right, the objects would disappear for a fraction of a second before returning to exactly the same position. There was no visible movement, no explosion, and no obvious physical force pushing them away. They simply ceased to be there and then returned as though nothing had happened. The phenomenon was unlike anything Mike had ever encountered. The garage filled with the sharp smell of ozone produced by the high-voltage equipment. The air felt different, almost charged with anticipation. Each successful disappearance convinced him that he was witnessing something extraordinary. Whether it was a breakthrough in physics, a strange interaction of electromagnetic fields, or something entirely unknown, Mike believed he had uncovered a mystery that could change everything. That moment marked the beginning of an obsession that would eventually consume his life and lead him down a path from which there would be no turning back. The Coast to Coast Calls. In January 1995, Mike Markham decided to share his incredible story with a wider audience. He called Coast to Coast AM, the nationally syndicated late-night radio show hosted by Art Bell. At the time, the program had become famous for exploring the unexplained. Listeners tuned in nightly to hear stories about UFO sightings, paranormal encounters, government conspiracies, and strange mysteries that mainstream media often ignored. Yet among the countless unusual callers who appeared on the show, Mike stood out. He did not sound like someone chasing attention or trying to create a sensational story. His voice carried a mixture of uncertainty, curiosity, and genuine concern. He sounded like a man struggling to understand something that had happened right in front of him. During the interview, Mike described the strange events taking place inside his garage laboratory. According to him, small objects positioned near his experimental electrical field were disappearing entirely before reappearing moments later. These objects were not being pushed aside or blown away. They simply vanished and then returned to exactly the same location. Art Bell listened carefully and asked the questions many listeners were already thinking. Could the phenomenon be an optical illusion? Could heat from the electrical arc be distorting the air and tricking his eyes? Was it possible that reflections from the laser beam were creating a visual effect? Mike rejected those explanations. He insisted that what he was seeing was real. More importantly, he claimed the effects went beyond the disappearing objects. Whenever the field became active, the atmosphere inside the garage seemed to change. The air felt unusually heavy, almost as if the room itself had become denser. There was a strange sensation that he found difficult to describe. Even more unsettling were the reactions of animals. Mike explained that his dog, which had previously followed him everywhere, now refused to enter the garage. Birds that normally landed on the roof stopped appearing altogether. It seemed as though living creatures sensed something unusual long before Mike understood what was happening. Rather than treating these warning signs as reasons to stop, Mike became even more determined to continue. Convinced he was on the verge of a major discovery, he began increasing the power of his equipment. To accomplish this, he took a drastic and illegal step. Mike stole several industrial transformers from a nearby electrical substation and incorporated them into his setup. The additional power dramatically increased the energy flowing through his experiments. The consequences were immediate. Neighbors experienced power fluctuations, lights dimmed unexpectedly, and electrical disturbances spread throughout the area. Utility workers eventually traced the unusual energy drain directly to Mike's property. Authorities arrested him, and he was sentenced to 60 days in county jail. For most people, the experience would have marked the end of the project. For Mike, it became an opportunity to think. While incarcerated, he filled notebooks with sketches, calculations, and revised circuit designs. Instead of abandoning the experiment, he became even more obsessed with solving its mysteries. After his release, Mike once again contacted Art Bell. This time, his claims were even more disturbing. Objects were no longer disappearing for mere fractions of a second. Some remained gone for several seconds before returning. A wooden block that vanished came back unnaturally cold to the touch. A flower reportedly disappeared and returned wilted and dried, as though much more time had passed for it than for the surrounding world. Then Mike revealed the experiment that shocked listeners the most. He had tested the field on a mouse. According to Mike, the animal vanished for several seconds before reappearing alive, but visibly traumatized. It behaved erratically, refused food and water, and appeared severely disoriented. Within a few days, it died. The revelation deeply concerned Art Bell. He immediately urged Mike to stop the experiments and seek help from qualified scientists who could properly evaluate the risks involved. But Mike refused. He believed he was closer than ever to understanding the phenomenon. In his mind, abandoning the project now would mean walking away from the greatest discovery of his life. Unfortunately, the breakthrough he was chasing would eventually lead him toward a mystery far stranger and far more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. The night Mike vanished. By early 1996, Mike Markham's experiments had evolved far beyond the simple disappearing objects that had first captured his attention. Years of tinkering, modifying equipment, and increasing the power of his setup had produced something far stranger than he originally imagined. According to Mike's final public discussions, the mysterious electrical field he had created was no longer affecting only small objects placed nearby. It had grown powerful enough for him to partially enter it himself. What happened next would become one of the most unsettling parts of the entire story. Mike claimed that stepping into the edge of the field produced sensations unlike anything he had ever experienced. Time itself seemed to behave differently. Sounds stretched unnaturally, as though they were being played back at the wrong speed. Ordinary noises became distorted and distant. Movement appeared slower. The world outside the field seemed disconnected, almost as if it existed behind an invisible barrier. The experience was difficult to describe, but one detail stood out above all others. Whenever Mike stepped back out of the field, more time had passed than he believed he had experienced inside it. To anyone listening, the implications were obvious. When Mike returned to Coast AM and spoke with Art Bell, the question hanging over the conversation could no longer be avoided. Had he built a time machine? Art asked him directly. Mike hesitated before answering. He admitted that he did not know. The effects certainly seemed connected to time, but the more experiments he conducted, the less convinced he became that time alone was involved. Instead, he began to suspect that the field was affecting reality itself, something far more complex and potentially dangerous. As the months passed, Mike's behavior reportedly became increasingly erratic. Friends and listeners noticed changes in his tone. The excitement that had once driven him was now mixed with anxiety and suspicion. He believed people were watching him. Strange vehicles near his property suddenly seemed significant. He worried that government agencies had learned about his work and were monitoring his activities. Whether those fears were justified or simply the result of stress remains unknown. Then, in March 1997, Mike Markham vanished. Without warning, he disappeared from public view. His phone was disconnected. Letters sent to his address were returned unopened. Friends and acquaintances could not contact him. It was as though he had simply ceased to exist. Soon afterward, another shocking development occurred. A fire destroyed Mike's garage. When investigators examined the site, they discovered evidence of an intense electrical event. Transformers had melted. Thick copper wiring had been reduced to twisted wreckage. Deep scorch marks covered the floor. At the center of the destruction was a mysterious circular burn pattern measuring approximately 6 feet across. Yet despite the severity of the fire, there was one thing investigators could not find: Mike. There was no body, no human remains, no indication that he had died in the blaze. Only a single handwritten note hidden inside a metal toolbox. The message was brief but chilling. It is not about time, it is about how you see things. The mystery quickly spread across the growing internet. Discussion forums exploded with theories. Some believed Mike had successfully traveled into the future. Others argued that government agents had secretly removed him because of what he had discovered. Still others suggested he had accidentally opened a doorway into another dimension and stepped through it. Years passed without answers. Then, in 2006, the mystery took an even stranger turn. A physics professor reportedly received an email from someone claiming to be Mike Markham. The message contained advanced technical diagrams, warnings about dangerous experiments, and references to concepts Mike had never publicly discussed. Before anyone could investigate further, the sender vanished again. Attempts to reply failed. The trail went cold. For nearly 2 more decades, Mike Markham existed only as rumors, scattered clues, and unanswered questions. He seemed less like a missing person and more like a ghost leaving traces behind. Then, decades after his disappearance, something happened that would change the entire story forever. The return of Mike Markham. In October 2022, a discovery inside a quiet Ohio farmhouse reignited one of the strangest mysteries of the modern era. Andrew and Melanie Carter were in the middle of renovating their aging property when they uncovered something unexpected hidden behind the attic walls. It was a wooden box coated in dust and tucked away where no casual visitor would ever find it. Written across the top in faded handwriting were 2 simple words: M. Markham. Curious, the couple opened the box and found its contents carefully preserved. Inside were journals filled with handwritten entries, complex circuit diagrams, electronic components, photographs, and notes spanning decades. The material appeared to document years of research and experimentation. One photograph immediately captured their attention. It showed a large ring-shaped machine constructed from metal and electrical equipment. On the back, someone had written a brief but unsettling message. It worked, but not the way I thought it would. As the Carters continued examining the journals, they discovered something even stranger. One notebook contained the exact address of their farmhouse. The address had been written years before they had ever purchased the property. Next to it were notes suggesting the location had been selected for long-term storage. Confused and fascinated, the couple shared details of their discovery online. The story spread quickly among people familiar with the Mike Markham mystery. Then something extraordinary happened. Andrew received a phone call from a man claiming to be Mike Markham himself. At first, the claim seemed impossible. Markham had supposedly vanished in 1997. Yet several weeks later, a man arrived at the farmhouse and introduced himself as the missing experimenter. According to the Carters, he appeared to be roughly the age Mike should have been had he lived normally since his disappearance. However, there was something unusual about him. He looked exhausted, weathered, and burdened by years of hardship. Over the course of several hours, he shared a story unlike anything the couple expected to hear. Mike insisted that he had never traveled through time. Instead, he claimed that his machine had done something far stranger. According to him, the device had desynchronized him from reality itself. He described the condition as existing slightly out of phase with the rest of the world. He was not invisible. He had not vanished into another dimension. He was still present, but somehow disconnected from the normal processes through which people perceive and remember one another. After stepping fully into the machine's field, he said something fundamental had changed. People could see him, but they struggled to remember him afterward. Conversations faded quickly from memory. Records became difficult to maintain. Friends recognized his face, but could not place where they knew him from. Interactions that should have been memorable seemed to evaporate almost immediately. According to Mike, every subsequent exposure to the machine made the condition worse. Over time, he became increasingly difficult for others to perceive, identify, and remember. Rather than transforming him into a time traveler, he believed the machine had damaged something even more essential: the invisible connection that allows a person to remain anchored in the minds of others. If he was correct, he had not traveled through time at all. He had begun slipping out of reality itself. The horror of unmemory. The most disturbing part of Mike's account came after he left the Carter farmhouse. Andrew and Melanie later reported something they could barely explain. Almost immediately after Mike departed, details about him began slipping away. They struggled to recall his appearance. The sound of his voice faded. Specific memories dissolved within hours. Melanie reportedly began writing notes as quickly as possible because she could feel the memories disappearing while they were still fresh. Within days, the couple relied heavily on those notes to reconstruct the conversation. Years later, they described the experience as remembering a movie they once watched long ago. The evidence remained, the journals remained, the photographs remained. But the direct memory of Mike himself became increasingly difficult to hold on to. Mike called this phenomenon unmemory, not ordinary forgetting, something deeper, a gradual erosion of a person's presence within the minds of others. If his theory was correct, then the machine never manipulated time. It manipulated observation. It interfered with the invisible connection that allows human beings to recognize, remember, and validate one another's existence. Mike believed a person is more than a body. A person is also a pattern maintained inside the memories of countless other people. And according to him, the machine damaged that pattern. The result was terrifying. A man who could still walk through the world, speak to strangers, and leave physical evidence behind, yet slowly become impossible for anyone to truly remember. Perhaps that is why reports of Mike continued appearing over the years. A man resembling him at a university. A conference attendee introducing himself as Mike Markham. A technically skilled stranger staying briefly in a shelter before disappearing. Every account uncertain. Every witness struggling to recall details, as if reality itself was slowly letting him fade away. Conclusion: Whether Mike Markham's story is fact, fiction, exaggeration, or an elaborate legend, it remains one of the most fascinating mysteries ever connected to the idea of time travel. Unlike traditional stories about journeys through history, this tale asks a much darker question. What if existence depends not only on being alive, but on being remembered? If memory is part of what makes us real, then losing that connection could be worse than death itself. Somewhere, according to the legend, Mike Markham may still be wandering through ordinary streets, leaving behind clues that nobody can quite hold on to. If you enjoyed this story and want more mysteries, legends, and unexplained cases, don't forget to like and subscribe. Until next time, keep questioning the impossible.